Hello. In this video we're going to review the basics of trade, talking about issues such as comparative advantage, specialization, and we're going to start this example by assuming we have two countries, the United States and Japan. Each country can produce two goods, grain and steel. The United States production possibilities frontier is given up here in the top left. If we allocate all our resources to producing nothing but grain in the United States, we could produce 100 units of grain. If we allocate all our resources to the production of steel, we could produce 50 units of steel. We're going to assume that the United States will produce a combination of grain and steel where we're producing 60 units of grain and 20 units of steel, a point on the PPF curve. Japan likewise can produce grain and steel. If Japan allocates all its resources to grain production, it can produce 40 units of grain. If it allocates all its resources to the production of steel, it can produce 40 units of steel. We're going to assume that Japan locates on its PPF at a point right here, highlighted by this point, which corresponds to 30 units of grain and 10 units of steel. Usually the first thing we want to do in these types of problems is figure out who has a comparative advantage in which good. The way to do that is to construct a simple table like I've shown here, and we're basically trying to calculate the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of something. In this case, one more unit of steel and one more unit of grain, the two goods in question. So in this first column here, I have the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of steel. In the United States, the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of steel is going to be 2 units of grain. In other words, every time we produce one more unit of steel in the United States, the cost comes in giving up the opportunity of producing 2 units of grain. The way I calculated that answer is by using that formula that I talked about in the previous video, where we take what you give up and divide it by what you get. In the United States, what we give up in producing steel is 100 units of grain. What do we get? 50 units of steel. So 100 divided by 50 is where the answer 2 is coming from. In Japan, we're going to calculate the opportunity cost the same way. In Japan, what we give up if we're producing steel is 40 units of grain. What do we get in return? In Japan, if we give up producing 40 units of grain, what do we get? 40 units of steel, so 40 divided by 40 is just 1 unit of grain. So maybe I'll just write that here. And that's where the 2 came from. Now to examine the opportunity cost of producing the other item, in this case grain, it's what you give up divided by what you get. If we're producing nothing but grain in the United States, we're giving up producing 50 units of steel. What are we getting back? The 100 units of grain. 50 divided by 100 gives us the opportunity cost of 1/2. Every time we produce one more grain, in other words, one more unit of grain, in other words, we give up producing 1/2 unit of steel. For Japan, if we're producing nothing but grain, we are producing, we're giving up producing 40 units of steel. We're getting 40 units of grain, so the opportunity cost is 1 unit of steel. Every time we produce one more unit of grain in Japan, we always give up producing 1 unit of steel. So given these values, these numbers, we can now calculate comparative advantage. So let's see who has a comparative advantage in which good. In terms of producing steel, it looks like Japan has a comparative advantage in the production of steel. Every time Japan produces one more unit of steel, it only gives up 1 unit of grain. But the US gives up 2 units of grain. Therefore, Japan is has a comparative advantage in steel production. So let me note that here. Japan's comparative advantage, CA, is in steel production. 1 is less than 2. Now let's see about the production of grain. Who produces grain at the lowest opportunity cost? Well, it appears that the US has a comparative advantage in grain production. Every time you produce one more unit of grain in the United States, you're only giving up 1/2 unit of steel, while in Japan you would have to give up a full unit. So the United States U.S. has a comparative advantage in grain production. In these problems then, generally what we're going to do next is we're going to assume that each country is going to completely specialize in their comparative advantage, and then they're going to trade with the other country for the good that they don't have a comparative advantage in. So let's go through that analysis now. To finish up this video, I want to show how both countries can benefit from comparative advantage, specialization, and trade. We're going to have a table here at the bottom with several columns. The first set of columns shows the situation, should be without trade. Let me put a O there. Without trade. Assuming that the United States and Japan are self-sufficient, not trading with one another, we can assume that the U.S. is going to produce and consume 60 units of grain and 20 units of steel. We're also going to assume that Japan is going to produce and consume 30 units of grain and 10 units of steel. Note at the beginning of the video I illustrated where those points were located along the production possibilities frontiers. Now we have a next set of columns here that I'm calling the specialization columns. You can assume that each country is going to specialize in their comparative advantage. In the United States case, they're going to do nothing but produce grain. Grain, after all, is what we argued is what the United States has a comparative advantage in. So the United States will produce 100 units of grain, and if the U.S. is producing 100 units of grain, can't produce any steel. Japan is going to specialize in its comparative advantage, which we argued is steel production. So Japan at most can produce 40 units of steel, and if it's producing 40 units of steel, it can't produce any grain. Now what we want to do is to come up with some terms of trade that will basically make both countries better off. So one such terms would be that the United States trades 35 units of grain for 25 units of Japanese steel. So once again, the terms of trade might be that the United States is going to trade 35 units of grain for 25 units of Japanese steel. So if the United States trades away 35 units of grain, it'll have 65 units of grain. Just simply 100 minus 35. What does the United States get back? Well, according to the terms of trade, it'll get back 25 units of steel. Now, from Japan's perspective, Japan is receiving 35 units of grain. Okay, it wasn't producing any grain while it was specializing, so it's going to get 35 units of United States grain. What does it cost Japan to do that? Well, Japan has to trade away 25 units of steel. So 40 minus 25 is 15. Let's examine these trade numbers here at the end. With trade, the United States is consuming 65 units of grain and 25 units of steel. What's interesting about that point, it's going to be a point outside the United States production possibilities frontier. With trade, a country can consume beyond its PPF. Japan, the same thing. This consumption point of 35 units of grain and 15 units of steel is going to be a point that is outside Japan's production possibilities frontier. Trade allows us to have a much larger level of consumption than otherwise would be the case if we were simply self-sufficient. The last thing I want to do in highlighting the benefits of trade is to show you that the U.S. is buying a unit of steel for 35 divided by 25, what you give up divided by what you get again, for only 1.4 units of grain. So the U.S. is buying a unit of steel, in essence, for 1.4 units of grain. If the United States was self-sufficient and didn't trade, it would cost the United States 2 units of grain to produce 1 unit of steel. So the United States is clearly benefiting from this. It's cheaper for the United States simply to buy steel from Japan than to produce it for themselves. In Japan, the same thing. Japan is buying 1 unit of grain for 25 divided by 35, what you give up divided by what you get, or 0.71 units of steel. It costs Japan 1 unit of steel to produce 1 unit of grain. So it's simply cheaper for Japan to get its grain from the United States than to produce it for itself. Okay, I hope you found this video helpful.